Welcome, everybody. I'm really thrilled today to have this chance to have a conversation with one of my heroes, progressive and social justice champion, and my friend, Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal. She is currently a member of Congress from Washington State, and she's known for being a leader on economic justice, racial justice, immigrant rights, women's rights, been a key leader in the fight for Medicare for all and a decent, just recovery package in this country. And one of the most inspiring things about her story is that she really comes out of a life of activism and social change. So her life story really bridges moving from social movements to being a voice for people in social movements in the halls of power. So we're thrilled and lucky to have you with us today, Pramila. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Deepak. And I just have to say, there's very few people in the country that are as thoughtful, strategic, with the organizing background that you have, and we are desperately going to need those, assuming we get to a place in November that we want to be in. And so thank you for your incredible leadership. CUNY is so lucky to have you.
Thank you, sister. So you have a new book, which I highly recommend to everybody. It's called Use the Power You Have, A Brown Woman's Guide to Politics and Political Change. And in that, you tell your own incredible story as an immigrant, as a woman of color, moving from the outside, the social movements that propel change on the outside, to working on the inside. And you're the first South Asian woman to be elected to Congress. So I'm wondering if you could just talk to us a little bit about your journey and what it's been like to make change and move from the outside to the inside.
Yeah, well, as an organizer on the outside for almost 2 decades, to be totally frank, I was quite dismissive of politics and being in office. And I remember talking to you at various times when I would sort of think about it and then, say to myself, no, I'd rather be trying to make change on the outside. That's really where I feel the power is. But what I realized, sort of in a flash of clarity, maybe one year, was that we organizers, and I started the largest immigrant advocacy organization in Washington State, ran it for 12 years, worked on, getting the Seattle to be the first major city in the country to pass a $15 minimum wage, often pushing progressive ideas long before they were popular, and working with people on the ground who were deeply involved and rooted in their own experiences. What I realized suddenly is, wait a second, maybe we're thinking about this all wrong. Maybe we have to think about elected office as an organizing platform and, really think about how we get power on the inside as well. And over time, I think we'll change these words outside, inside. I just haven't found the right set of words, so it's shorthand right now. But I think we need organizers on the inside. That was my theory of change, is that if we had organizers on the inside at the tables where policy decisions were being made, but also organizing on the inside and using the platform to help move organizing on the outside as well. It's a big platform, and particularly as a member of Congress, it's an opportunity to really push bold ideas, to enhance and support outside movement organizing, and to coordinate strategy, inside outside strategies, so that we can get big progressive policies. That was the theory of change, and tied to that was the idea that if we had more people in office who actually represented the interests of the vast majority of people, that we would actually get more engagement in our democracy. And so that was what I ran on. I first ran for the state Senate. That was sort of like, the opportunity to see if I thought we could really do what we wanted. And I was the state senator for the most diverse legislative district in Washington State for 2 years. And then this seat for Congress opened up and I ran for it. And now I serve as the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which is really, I think, the organizing platform for progressives inside of Congress. We represent about 40% of the Democratic caucus. And I think that transition I haven't stopped being an organizer. I still describe myself as an organizer. Honestly, I find that many members of Congress don't think about organizing on the inside. It's not so simple as just introducing a bill and saying, if you actually want to get things done, you have to do a lot of organizing.
Well, and it feels like you arrived at the national scene in Congress at a pivotal time in our history, and a really hard time in our history. And so I'm wondering if you could reflect on this fraught moment we now find ourselves in, what's at stake from your perspective in the election, what's our task in this next period of time, really to save and restore our democracy.
Yes, that small question. Well, I was elected on the same night as Donald Trump was elected. And, somebody, I think it was The Nation or Mother Jones, said, I am the anti-Trump. They deem me the anti-Trump. This was 2017. It was a couple of years before the squad was elected. We didn't have the majority in the House. Then, of course, we got the majority in the House in 2018. But even at the beginning, Deepak, I think one of the two things I would say that are background to our conversation. The first is that, it's relatively easy to be an opposition party. And I think we unite more quickly around being an opposition party. It's harder to be a proposition party. But I don't think that we as Democrats can be just an opposition party at any time. We have to be a proposition party. And so even during those first 2 years when we had no power in the House, really very little power in the House, in the minority, I felt it was really important to draw a vision of what we stand for and draw people into that vision. Medicare for all, a Green New Deal, fair economy that works for everybody, getting money out of politics. I mean, these are critically, climate change, these are critically important issues. And of course, immigration reform, one of the things you and I have worked on so closely for a long time. The second is that, because going back to that point, I just don't think you inspire people just by being against things. I mean, certainly Trump has been so outrageous that we have inspired a lot of people to come out and vote just to get him out of office. But I think you got to have more than that to really hold people. The second thing is that Donald Trump was both a symptom and a cause. And I think that's very important to remember. Even before Donald Trump came into office, even before COVID-19 hit, we had a situation where 40% of Americans didn't even have $400 in their bank account. Even before COVID hit, we had 87 million Americans who were either uninsured or underinsured. And so you go into these moments of deep crisis, the Donald Trump presidency and a constitution destroying racist xenophobe, the COVID health pandemic that has now taken 220,000 lives in our country, and 8.5 million people now have pre-existing conditions from having contracted COVID. 50 million people, the economic crisis, 50 million Americans who have filed for unemployment, and 27 million who lost their health care at the same time that they lost their jobs. And then, of course, the deep reckoning that is still roiling our country because it is so deeply institutionalized that racism and white supremacy and anti-Blackness is built into every one of our structures. And so we're seeing an awakening, but we haven't yet seen the commitment to change. And so that is the moment that we're in. And I think it's very important to recognize that Donald Trump is a cause of some of the worst suffering we've seen in recent memory. Cruelty, targeting, xenophobia of certain groups of people, a complete lack of any caring for a constitution or for the responsibility of a president to look after everybody and not politicize things, plus very destructive systemic things that he's instituted. But he's also a symptom. People were frustrated in 2016 with the political system and with both parties. They were frustrated with Democrats for not taking bold action to rectify the issues of working people. And I think that is just incredibly important. Now, last thing I'll say on this is, and this is like the crux of everything I know you want to talk about today. So hopefully we'll have time to go more detail into each of these things. But the COVID crisis has just worsened inequality in this country dramatically. I mean, the wealth of billionaires has now reached a high of $10.2 trillion during this crisis. And the Rand Corporation just came out with a very interesting study that looked at incomes over the last 30 years. And since the 1970s, a total of $50 trillion has been transferred from the bottom 90% of Americans to the top 1% of Americans. In real everyday terms for working people, it means that if you're a full-time wage earner in America, and if you're earning $50,000 now, just for your salary to have kept pace with GDP and inflation, you would need to be at $92,000 to $103,000. So workers are earning 50% of what they really should be earning, and that money is going to the wealthiest.
Well, it's such important context because we are in a crisis that seems to be potentially a rupture of previous paradigms for how we've thought about how the economy and society should be organized. And you have been pushing the edge in terms of proposals that are really about organizing to the future economy that we want, not just kind of patching around the edges of the inequality that we've been suffering with. So I wonder if you might forecast a little forward into the economic agenda that we as progressives should be pushing for in 2021 and beyond. In a stimulus bill and other contexts, what do you think needs to be at the core of our substantive agenda and vision?
Well, in terms of a stimulus bill, we have to be bold. I mean, the scale of this crisis is enormous. And what we learned from both history, FDR, even fighting off the Great Depression before it happened, plus, the Obama economic recovery package. What we've learned in every one of those instances is that the more you spend early on things that go directly to the people, not to the wealthiest corporations, this is not a trickle down thing. This is money in people's pockets, and stability for individuals to be able to weather a crisis, for small businesses to be able to weather a crisis. The more you invest now, the quicker the economy recovers and the less you have to spend in the long term. So first, we should get rid of any idea that we have to worry about deficits in this moment. That is just that will be a recipe for disaster. The stimulus package that we pass should also really take into account the disproportionate burden that Black and Brown people and Indigenous people have borne from COVID-19. So we've got to put in place real protections to make sure that those folks are getting additional hazard pay, that they're getting full benefits, that we protect frontline workers who are immigrants who don't have legal status but are putting food on the tables for people every single day. Those people should be provided with the ability to stay in the United States and have a path to citizenship. You can't say they're essential on one hand and expendable on the other. So I think that is the opportunity to shape the COVID relief package. Within that, there is an opportunity to actually build some structures that take care of people. So let's take childcare as an example. We have to think about not only the relief package, $1 into the relief package, but how do we build the structures that if we had another crisis like this, economic or health, that people would have the structures in place that they needed. That's healthcare for all. I obviously am the lead sponsor of Medicare for All, so that's what I believe we should be doing. But it's also childcare. Thinking about childcare as essential infrastructure, making sure that people have paid leave, and all of those things that go along with that. And I think that is a really important piece. Third, we're going to have to put people back to work. So a bold infrastructure package that is also about green energy, renewable energy, that really taps into the fact that we've got to deal with climate change and fight for climate justice. That will be a really important opportunity for us to both invest in our infrastructure, and I'm not talking about just roads and bridges, but how about internet, rural broadband, schools, water systems? I mean, the Flint, Michigan crisis of lead in the water, we need to fix that. And this is a great opportunity to do that. And then finally, we should put in place the kind of proposal that I tried to move forward in this last Congress, that I still have hope that I can move forward in the next Democratic administration, which is something like my bill is called the Paycheck Recovery Act. That puts in place a system where both now and for any future pandemic, we have economic stabilizers in place where if unemployment hits a certain level, if we have a healthcare pandemic, the government automatically goes into action to protect small businesses and regular working folks and families, vulnerable families across the country. That's what Germany did after the last recession. We can do that here. And that should include money that goes directly from the Treasury to a small business or a medium-sized business, to any business really, to keep workers in their jobs and to keep them in their benefits and subsidize their paychecks. That is the approach that most countries in Europe took during this pandemic, and also countries in Asia took. And it's why they've been so successful at both being able to scale up and down as the virus comes and goes. It's a healthcare bill as well, but also to protect particularly small and medium-sized businesses from shuttering, and most of all, to put money in people's pockets and to ensure that they have some stability. That affects the whole economy.
It seems so pivotal to have a visionary agenda like that actually solves these problems in a potentially a new administration, because it really traces back to what you said about how failures sometimes of democratic policymaking in the past laid the predicate for some of the resentments and angers that result in backlash politics. And so that really leads me to another kind of area I know you've been thinking about as co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which is you were a passionate supporter of Bernie Sanders, and as many people in our school have been. And you're obviously now a passionate supporter of Biden and Harris. But how do progressives understand their roles and responsibilities in the context of a Biden-Harris administration? And what can we learn from what might have gone well, what went badly in the Obama years? What do we need to do differently? What's the strategy so that those visionary ideas that you laid out, I'm signed up, that we can really make some progress on them?
Yeah. Yeah, well, let's start with the definition of a progressive. I always say that a progressive is just the first to the best and most just idea. And then we fight like hell to build a movement around us, and people show up a little bit late to the party sometimes. But when they do show up, we welcome them in, right? And so I think that that's important, because when you look at the history of change, at least in our recent history, we have had a Congress, and there's a study out. I wonder if CUNY was actually part of this study, but I just read a study that shows that it was Northwestern and some university in New York that shows that members of Congress are actually far more conservative than their districts for the most part. Not me, but many members of Congress are far more conservative, and it's because of the influence of money in politics. Just think about pharmaceutical drug pricing. There's 500 lobbyists outside your door trying to push for no restraints on pharmaceutical drug pricing. And so what the research found is that members tend to listen to those constituents, those lobbyists, those big businesses, rather than regular people, rather than small businesses. So if you recognize that, then you understand how important the outside movement is. I think that we, were able to negotiate when Senator Sanders asked me to be the co-chair of the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force on Healthcare. We discussed this, and I said, Vice President Biden is not going to be for Medicare for all. We're not turning Biden into Bernie Sanders, but he is the nominee. So how do we get some of the foundational aspects of universal single-payer healthcare into the Biden plan? And we were able to negotiate amazing things. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, as co-chair of the Climate Committee, was able to negotiate the same thing. She didn't get Biden to say he's for the Green New Deal, but there are substantial pieces of what we are trying to move forward in the Biden administration. So we can genuinely say, number one, that progressives have deeply affected the platform. Number two, that this is the most progressive Democratic Party platform that we've had in recent history. And number three, that there is no progress possible with Donald Trump in the White House. And everything that we care about is on the line, including our Constitution, our democracy. Look at what he's doing with the Supreme Court. Today, they're going to vote out that nomination out of the Judiciary Committee with not a single Democrat in just a few, not even under 2 weeks from the election. A hypocritical stance for a party that blocked the nomination of Merrick Garland under President Obama for 8 months. So we have to now think about how we get everybody out to vote and we get Trump out of the White House. We've got to do that. We've got to try to flip the Senate, and we've got to get a more progressive majority into the House. Now, once we've done those things, then we have to be ready to negotiate and to push for the most progressive platform first, and then understand we're not going to get everything, but the more that we can push and the more we can make sure we're not doing damage to anything that we've done, right? We've got to be willing to then move forward some of these reforms as best we can. So that's the work that we have in front of us. I think the Biden platform is very, very good on many things. But it's the floor. We're going to have to fight, by the way, just to keep it as the floor. That's going to be its own battle. And then we're going to have to fight to make it not the ceiling.
Yeah, I'm glad you talked about the role that progressives have played kind of in this inside-outside way that you've been part of, because I do think it's a pivotal way in which change occurs. And maybe you could just say a little bit about the Progressive Caucus, because I feel like there's been a revolution that you've been part of, a leader of, to really change, to bridge that disconnect between where the people are and where the elected representatives are. And now to see some of you organizing to kind of have leverage. I'm just curious if you could talk about the growth of the caucus and what role it might play.
Yeah, well, the Progressive Caucus was established several decades ago by Bernie Sanders, Maxine Waters, Pete DeFazio, some other really great progressive members of the House. It operated largely as a social club for a long time. There were no real rules for the caucus. There were no real structures around it. When Keith Ellison and Raul Grijalva became co-chairs, they started to put some of those things into place. And that was just 2 years before I came in. When I came in and Keith recruited me to be the first to run for first vice chair, I had no idea what I was getting into. It's an enormous amount of work. But Mark Pocan was co-chair along with Grijalva. And we started to see that there was actually, I came in and I was shocked as an organizer. I'm like, where's my infrastructure? Where are my tools that allow me to organize? And I'm kind of an infrastructure gal, as you know. And so we then got to work with a number of people building a couple of things. On the outside, we built the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center, which is a 501c3 organization, and the Progressive Caucus Action Fund, which is a 501c4 organization that can do some political grassroots lobbying. That was very important because that coordinates all the progressive think tanks, all the progressive groups, and is able to both be proactively and reactively useful to members of Congress to counter the influence of lobbyists. On the inside, we had one staff person for the entire Progressive Caucus, 100 members. It was ridiculous. We hadn't raised our dues in, I don't know, like a decade. We had no staff. People like kind of came and went. And so we increased our dues. We hired more staff, including a communications person, a policy person, et cetera, that can respond to members of Congress. And this year, and then also on the PAC side, we got a number of new members, so we increased our numbers. On the PAC side, we realized we needed to elect more progressives and we needed to get engaged early. And so we were raising about $300,000 on the PAC side. We dramatically ramped up that. We said no corporate PAC contributions. The CPC PAC used to take corporate PAC contributions. We said no more. We're only funded by small dollar donors. And we now have raised $4 million in the last cycle. So we were able to elect progressives like Mondaire Jones, like Jamal Bowman, like Cori Bush. We're fighting for Kari Eastman, for Beth DeLeo, for people in Texas, Julie Oliver, Mike Siegel, et cetera, Candace Valenzuela. That will help us to grow our ranks. So the last thing we're doing now is trying to get some more reforms through. I have a reforms package that a small committee has put together that will hopefully allow us to leverage power more effectively in the next Congress and stop people from using a progressive label if you're not actually going to vote like a progressive.
Well, I think there's unfortunately stuff for us to learn from the right about organization and discipline, bringing that to bear in combination with our values. And you're a perfect leader to really bring that sensibility to Congress. So let's talk about racial justice in a new administration. This is one of those areas where an insurgent movement that has exposed the depth of racism in this country for millions of people to see, current and past, and accumulating racism, is going to meet, we hope, an administration that at least, in a Congress that are at least willing to look at these questions in a serious way. What might we look for in terms of a response from Congress and policymakers to the call from the Movement for Black Lives for reform and for justice in 2021?
The movement for Black Lives has been transformational in our country. I really believe that. I mean, the work that has been done that underlies the hashtag is so substantial. It is organizing work on the ground, it's leadership development work on the ground, and it's policy work, at local, state, and federal levels. And I just have so much respect for the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, all queer women, and also for the way in which they have been able to grow that movement so dramatically. You and I know that strength comes in times of crisis, and the best organizing moments are sometimes the worst moments in terms of realizations of what's happening. But that is what moves people to action. And I think that the Black Lives Matter movement did so much preparation work before we ever got to, the George Floyd, I can't breathe moment. And so I think now what we need to look for is, first of all, the Biden administration taking a very clear leadership role in talking about racial injustice, violent white supremacy, which the FBI has even said is the #1 domestic terror threat to our country. And yet we have a president who stoked that movement. That's not going to go away. And so the Biden administration is going to have to really immediately, clearly articulate its commitment to taking on anti-Blackness, white supremacy, and racial injustice, and police reform. And this is going to be a hard one, as you've seen, because Trump is running on a law and order message. Luckily, it's not working. But I do think that there's a lot of hesitancy within even the Democratic Party to alienate voters who are still making their way through the morass of what is before us and their role and complicity in that. So that, I think, will be challenging. But I do know that the Biden administration is deeply committed to addressing racial inequities. They've made that a centerpiece of their platform on everything, including in climate change, making sure that 40% of whatever we spend on addressing climate goes to frontline BIPOC and other workers who are displaced, those communities. That's very important. And we need that across the board. It can't just be, well, we're going to take care of law enforcement. It's also about our budgeting practices. I mean, the fact that people don't get money for education, for housing, and instead we're spending all this money on the Pentagon and law enforcement. But at the core, if you give people opportunities to improve their lives and to, have assistance from the government to equalize opportunity and counter the racism that Black and brown folks and Indigenous folks are experiencing, that's what we really need.
Yeah, I'm so glad you talked about racial justice as an agenda and as an agenda that's in every other agenda that
Exactly.
we look for, whether it's climate or the recovery bill, et cetera. And a colleague at Columbia and I just came out with a paper today that looks at the enforcement budget in the United States. What laws do we enforce? And Alex Hertel Fernandez and I did research about this, and even I was stunned by the extent to which your point is correct. The extent to which we are spending resources on enforcing, policing immigration laws and not enforcing, making a choice as a country not to enforce gender equality, racial equality, fair housing laws, worker protection laws. That is a big area. I think there could be huge progress.
Very
So,
important. I'd love to see that paper, by the way, so send it over to
absolutely.
me.
And in a world where people worry, they shouldn't be worried about austerity, but to the extent that there are, these are things that can be done by reallocating resources we have. So I want to talk about another issue dear to our hearts, which is immigration. And I should note that Congressman Jayapal wrote a key chapter for this book that's forthcoming early in 2021 that I think is a visionary piece that really breaks open how we think about how immigration is done in this country and the structures, the punitive and unworkable structures that have built up since 9/11. So the damage that's been done is really almost unfathomable. And I don't know if you had, I'm sure you had the same reaction I did about hearing the reporting around children who have still not been reunited with their parents who've been deported that just came out. It's sort of it's devastating and an indictment of our national government, of this administration. What do you see as the path back? So there's so much to undo, and there's also so much affirmative work we need to do to build a welcoming country. And I know you're in the middle of thinking about this right now. How are you thinking about what a visionary politics and strategy and policy for immigration looks like in 2021?
Well, writing that chapter for your book was really helpful because it forced me to actually think about what the path forward is. And then, of course, we've been convening the key group of immigrant organizations that are doing the work on the ground that have been so central and pivotal to everything we've achieved on immigration. So we're, I think we're still in that process. But you said earlier something that I think bears repeating, which is that, even under Democratic administrations, there was a lot of harm done. And so we are not only undoing the harms of what Donald Trump did, which were horrendous. I mean, nothing that like what we've ever seen in I would say recent history on multiple levels. But at the same time, those tools were handed to him. They were handed to him by the 1996 laws that criminalized immigrants and even excluded immigrants from key benefits like CHIP and Medicaid and healthcare. Even if you were a legal permanent resident, you were excluded from many of those things. They've been, he was handed some of those tools by the conversations and the narratives around sort of violent immigrant offenders. And this is true in the criminal justice system as well. When immigration law and criminal law and the intersections are very complex, most people don't know that the vast majority of immigrants, 96% of immigrants, do not have an attorney to navigate a very complex immigration system. So there's a lot that we have to undo from Donald Trump, and there's actually a lot we have to undo from previous administrations that lend the narrative of the criminal immigrant, of immigrants, overtaking us, of not paying taxes. So many myths that have been put out there in part by some of these policies. So I think that to do that, we should rethink the structure of immigration services within the administration. And in the chapter, I propose dismantling the Department of Homeland Security and restructuring it completely. It was only created right after 9/11. There was no Department of Homeland Security before that. And when it was created, they took all these things, they put immigration services and enforcement together into this new department. They added in Coast Guard, FEMA, all these things that have made the Department of Homeland Security a completely unaccountable department that a dictator like Donald Trump could use to his benefit, move money around, do all kinds of things. So let's restructure that. Let's create a cabinet level department of immigration services and integration. And not only do all of the work of naturalization and services, expand the role of integration for the federal government, English language, job training, all of the things that immigrants need to really contribute their full selves to our government. Separate out enforcement so you don't have this, this problem of immigrants not seeking help when they think they're going to be deported, and either create a separate agency for that or put it in with a few other enforcement agencies, but take away some of those big tools and the focus there. And then, of course, we're going to need to, at the end of the day, we're going to need to pass a comprehensive immigration reform package, but we may be able to get a few quick bills done that return power to the people for 8 to 9 million of our immigrants. If we were to pass the Dream and Promise Act, which was the most progressive we passed in the House, if we were to make sure that we have an even better farm workers bill than what we passed, that alone would get us 6 to 8 million people on the path to citizenship. And then we've got to tackle family reunification, enforcement, get private prisons out. There's a lot more that we have to do there.
So exciting to hear about the possibilities and the notion that you might be a key interlocutor in helping to chart the path forward. One related question I should say, by the way, so Ruth Milkman, Penny Lewis, and I edited this volume that Pramila has a key chapter in. It's called Immigration Matters, Progressive Visions, Movements, and Strategies for the 21st Century. You can order it now on bookshop.org or elsewhere, and I hope you will. It's really incredibly exciting. So one thing that what you talked about really made me think about is the question of accountability. There's a little bit of this debate about how much do we look back and at the caging of children, at family separation, at the treatment of refugees, or in the case of race and racial justice, around the violation of that and questions around reparations and so forth over our history. And I guess just to state my own view is we kind of need to not do that thing of pretending everything didn't happen previously and just try and reset. But I'm curious how you think about, because it's such extraordinary harms have been done that have not really been accounted for. So how do you think about that part of the job?
We have to. We cannot allow this president to get away with what he's done. And I know the temptation is going to be great for a President Biden to just sort of try to bring the country together. But I really think that to bring the country together, you have to acknowledge those harms. It's why I'm also supporting that we take up a reparations bill. We have to deal with the issue of slavery in this country and what that has led to in terms of the effects on people. I think that, HR 40 and HR 100 sort of work together, a commission to study this and sort of a process for people to go through what this means and educate people, but also give real accountability to what happened. And I think we've got to do that with Donald Trump. I mean, this man, there is so much corruption, Deepak, that I have run out of words to describe this government. This administration. Cruel doesn't do it. You look at 525 kids that the Department of Homeland Security is telling us they can't find the parents for. You look at the thousands of families who were separated. You look at the way in which the arms of government, from the Department of Justice to the Health and Human Services to Secret Service, I mean, the ways in which money was funneled from the US taxpayer to Donald Trump and his entities and his families, and all of the corruption that was engaged there, not to mention the soliciting of foreign governments to interfere in our elections. If we don't address that and we just move on, the next dictator can come along, the next xenophobe can come along, the next corrupt president can come along and do the same things all over again. And look, our court system, we have to do a lot of court reforms. We have to do democracy reforms. I may have forgotten to mention that very important thing when I was talking about the priorities. That has to be the first thing we do. And we've really got to address the fact that people don't trust our courts anymore because they have been packed by the right wing with unaccountable, unqualified judges. And that is a real problem. So I just believe we have to hold Donald Trump accountable. We are not going to be able to heal and unite and move forward without that.
Really, really appreciate that. And so we have so many questions that I'm actually going to cut short my own questions because I feel obligation to really make sure people get a chance to interact with you here. So first question is about the labor movement and workers and kind of how, so there's a lot of appreciation here for kind of thinking about the inside outside and movements and legislation, and kind of how you see the future of the labor movement in the context of a new administration, what the labor movement needs to do. This is the School of Labor and Urban Studies, what role it can play in pushing this more progressive agenda, what role it is playing, how it can be renewed. So kind of your perspective on the future of the labor movement.
Well, I think that, obviously the right has been very effective at just really undercutting the power of workers and the power to collectively bargain, the power to organize, the power to strike. And I think we have to do all of that work. The PRO Act is a start, but I actually think there's a lot more that we could do. I've been involved in some really important conversations about redefining the labor agenda that have been, led by, of course, labor unions, some of the most progressive unions, the concept of sectoral bargaining. We have to increase the power of workers to organize by law. And we have to enforce that because that has been another problem, is the NLRB has not been beneficial to a lot of these efforts. And, it's been somewhat toothless or undermining of some of these efforts. So there's a lot of work we have to do there. But I do think that also, this is the time for the labor movement to really be as bold as possible, to organize within their memberships, but also to think intersectionally. The days of, labor being separated from everything else are gone. As we know from the Immigrant Workers' Freedom Ride that you and I were part of, in 2003, labor rights are workers' rights are labor rights. Immigration reform is a labor issue and it's an immigrant issue. I mean, this intersectionality is crucial for the labor movement. And the labor movement is one of the few places where there is still organized power. I know labor unions are always under attack. I know they always feel under attack, but actually they have a lot more power, particularly within the Democratic Party, than I think they always choose to use. And so that is the work to do with our labor brothers and sisters. Some of the most exciting organizing from teachers, the teacher strikes, the AFT has helped lead, and the NEA, but also, the flight attendants organizing has been fantastic. CWA has typically been a real progressive organizing union, and I think we need to help people to feel that power again. And obviously SEIU has been phenomenal, leading the fight for 15, and really thinking about how to grow the ranks of the SEIU with a particular focus on workers of color and low-wage workers.
That's great. And I want to note, there's a question from one of my students about kind of the conditions of low-wage work in the country and how part-time workers aren't getting access to healthcare and kind of all of the variety of ways in which low-wage workers are abused. And Congressman Jayapal has been a leader in kind of the push around Amazon and kind of the new tech companies and the new world of work. So hopefully we'll get a minute or two on talking about this new world of work we're entering and how policy should interact with it. There is a question
Hey,
here.
Deepak, one other quick thing,
Yeah.
really important to mention the alternative labor organizing that's also been going on. So outside of the formal context of a union, the domestic workers organizing, we will pass in the next Biden administration, I believe, my National Domestic Workers Bill of Rights that I put forward with Kamala Harris. It is part of the Biden platform. That would bring domestic workers, 2.5 million domestic workers, into the workforce and more able to then organize within even traditional structures. So I think that there is really good work doing on those alternative models of organizing as well.
Fantastic. And so there's a question here, which I know is on a lot of people's minds. What is your take on the danger of a Trump power grab if he loses the election? Yes, we hope a blue wave will make it very unlikely. Shouldn't we prepare? Please comment on, organizing efforts, protect the results, other things that are happening to contest. So how are you thinking about that fraught period between Election Day and January 20th?
Well, on the Judiciary Committee, we have an ongoing discussion about all of the ways, it's been very depressing actually, all of the ways that somebody could try to thwart the election and the results of an election and make one of those power grabs. So obviously we're preparing legal challenges, we're talking to the top attorneys, but really, Deepak, this will be a movement moment. And you have been involved in some of that really fantastic organizing that progressive groups have been doing around educating people on what that means, what the sacrifices will, require, and what the lessons are of nonviolent civil disobedience in this moment. I was in Sudan when my last trip, actually, before COVID hit, was to Sudan, a place that I've been very involved in with the organizers on the ground and overthrowing a brutal dictator. And I think that it's been so inspiring to see what regular people did, how many lives were lost, but for the cause of protecting the democracy, well, they didn't have a democracy, but getting to a democracy and protecting people. And I think that that may be required. And so, for people to hook in quickly with those organizing efforts and to be ready to do what is required of us should such a moment occur.
Such an important point for us to really internalize this lesson that democracy isn't some set of rules that exists elsewhere, some set of norms elsewhere. It's really us and our commitment to how we choose to show up and participate in society. That's what democracy is. Such an important comment. Question. I'm going to do two questions here in our closing time. One is about immigration enforcement and whether there's a way of using the budget process. And you alluded to this already, but how to use the budget process to get at the terror that families and communities are feeling, and whether that's a vehicle in. And then a question about what a new Biden administration could do to support community organizing and develop and support, new generation of organizers, especially from BIPOC communities, and broader organizing efforts. How can progressive governance really get the wheel going on organizing in communities of color?
Yeah, so absolutely on the appropriations question and the budget question. This is something I've been rabidly intent on since coming to Congress. And I'll tell you, it's been a rough road, but because of the Trump administration's transgressions, we may have actually made some movement on the idea that, number one, we shouldn't allocate money to these, rogue agencies. And number two, that if agencies do not do what we say they should do, like standards for immigration detention, that we take away their money. That has never been the case until I finally got some language into an appropriations bill. Now, of course, it's still not happening. We're not following through on it, in part because of divided government. But Democrats have to be bolder about using all the tools in our toolbox, and we're not. We're not always very bold on this. And so the appropriations process has to be a part of this. It's why we're pushing so hard, by the way, to reduce immigration enforcement funding, to get private prisons out of immigration. That's my Dignity for Detained Immigrants bill I hope everyone will look at, which is really transformative. But also to reduce even like Pentagon spending. I mean, military spending is getting used for, Defense Department spending is getting used for immigration enforcement. It's really crazy. And so, the court process is too long. We can't just rely on the courts to work these things out. On the question of community organizing, and I think the question was how the Biden administration can help.
How can a new administration support kind of organizing and communities of color, support the development of organizers, kind of any thoughts you have in that arena?
Well, I think that obviously in the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which was a first step, just a first step to reforms, but still the most sweeping reforms that Congress has undertaken on police accountability. One of the things I liked the most about it was that it had a grant program, not big enough in my mind, that was specifically to go to Black and Brown communities in local jurisdictions who were trying to reimagine policing and community safety. That kind of approach is really important. I was able to get, every year I doubled it. It's now at $10 million for diversion programs that was based on a model that we used here in Seattle to not put people into incarceration, but actually to provide them with support services if they're homeless or if they, are whatever it is that they need. Those kinds of things I think would be really useful because those are run by community-based organizations. But we also don't want to foster a mentality where people are taking money. You and I talked about this on immigration issues, taking money from the government and then don't want to criticize the government about what we need to do. So that's the only thing I would caution. But the biggest, look, the Biden administration is going to be dealing with a lot of issues, and probably giving more power to progressives may not be the thing that the Biden administration is anxious to do. But that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of ways. I mean, just funding education, funding green jobs, funding, housing, affordable housing. Those are all tools for us as community organizers to use in our organizing, both to educate people, to get resources to people, and then to use that services platform and transform it into an organizing platform.
Really good point. I mean, one of the things that came out of the 30s and the 60s were these, whether it was the National Labor Relations Act or OEO, which funded Black-led organizations to challenge white power structures for a brief period. Kind of what does that look like as a thing I think we all should be thinking about in a new context, even if it's not always direct or marketed that way? How do we think about things that have that effect, like what conservatives have done over the years with voting rights and stacking the courts and so forth? So really important thoughts on that. So maybe a couple of bigger picture questions as we close. So one is just curious, as you step back from our current democratic, small d, democratic crisis in the country, and you think about Trump and Trumpism and the fact that it's not going away, that there will be anti-democratic forces, anti-small d democratic forces, white nationalism on the surge, et cetera. Kind of how do we think about kind of a multiracial democracy and really building it for the long term? Like what do you think of beyond recovering ground? How do we think about what needs to be in place to really move us to a very, very different place than we are now?
Well, I think we have to think about power, right? This is all of our organizing work is about power. And we have both had power taken from us and we have given it away. Both things are true. So the electoral process, and even I as an organizer, I have mixed feelings, right, about the electoral process and getting involved in democracy. And so we try to keep ourselves pure by staying away from it. But that is actually giving away power. So we do have to figure out how to inspire people to engage in the electoral process and to vote, and to recognize that not voting is actually giving your vote and your power to somebody else. So that is very important. And I have a lot of conversations with young people who I feel terrible for, like what we've given to them. Why would people have faith, right? Except we're here and we're fighting. And I think about Sojourner Truth, and I think about all the amazing people in the history of the world that have achieved change. They didn't step away, they stepped into. And so that is really important. And then the second piece is the organizing part, which isn't at all about elections. It is about the everyday work of getting government to respond to the people. That is policy advocacy. It's organizing, it's reforming our tax structure, it's making these bold structural changes. But a lot of times you don't have power unless you have both of those things. That's why I got into elected office at the end of the day, because I realized, wait a second, what would it be like? How can we imagine a government that actually is representative and inspiring, where you don't have to explain what it means to be a Black or a brown or an Indigenous person or a low-wage worker, that you actually have people who are grounded in the principles of community and recognize that we're all better off when we're all better off. That's the basic principle here. And I think leading with love and with generosity, and recognizing that these times that seem so incredibly difficult, that are incredibly difficult, where we're being hit on every level. The thing I try to do is just wake up in the morning and first think about all the people that came before that fought for the rights that we have today and what they sacrificed. And then to put myself in the mind frame of we always win with generosity and abundance, never with scarcity and fear. And our job is to not leave a single thing on the table when we are fighting for people to get what they deserve: dignity, respect, a decent life, and all the things that go along with that.
So inspiring, and I feel channeled through you the words of one of the heroes we lost this year, Congressman John Lewis, who I feel like was a colleague to both of us and a tribune for that very vision of social justice as a vocation, something that happens every day, that we fight for every day, and that we live in how we treat other people. So thank you for those inspiring words. I want to thank Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal. She's the author of Use the Power You Have, A Brown Woman's Guide to Politics and Political Change. She's a brilliant progressive leader, and I have learned so much, as always, from engaging with you, and the whole community at CUNY and the larger progressive community is grateful for your leadership and sending you strength for these important weeks and months ahead. Thank you, my sister.
Thank you so much, Deepak. You are a gift to all of us. Thank you.